This could be the most extraordinary opportunity. And I think it is an opportunity for the United States in particular to show moral leadership, to take this moment when everybody is focused on Ukraine and say, okay, we're going to do this properly. And we're going to make President Biden's legacy the creation of a global refugee coalition.
Today, I'm speaking to Rory Stewart, a senior fellow at Yale University's Jackson Institute and former UK development minister, and also the author of a recent report from the Atlantic Council on the Afghan refugee crisis, How to Resurrect the Global Refugee Resettlement Coalition. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you for having me.
It sort of feels like the end of last year was the global crisis was the still ongoing crisis in Afghanistan. Added to that, now we have this Russian war in Ukraine. Do you think that the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, did they learn lessons from Afghanistan, and were they able to apply them to Ukraine?
Well, I certainly think the response on Ukraine has been stronger than in Afghanistan, stronger than Putin expected. And it's impressive to see the way that the United States, United Kingdom, Europe have come together and the speed with which they've been willing to speak up for Ukraine, supply armaments, impose sanctions. There is, however, a long way to go. And in the end, this whole thing rests on whether or not people are prepared to impose sanctions on oil and gas. And that's a big ask for Germany and Italy that get about half of their gas from Russia. So it will have huge economic consequences for the European economies and through the European economies for the global economy, but it must be done. Because unless we do that, Vladimir Putin is not actually going to feel much pain from this. He's spent the period since 2014 in Crimea essentially creating an economy that is protected against sanctions, with the exception really of oil and gas.
So you think that there should be sanctions on the energy sector, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that those should be imposed sooner rather than later?
Immediately.
Yeah.
And SWIFT payments should be frozen for oil and gas imports as well, because that's the only thing that will really make a difference to the Russian economy and make a difference to Putin's calculus. I think the second thing is that you drew the link between Afghanistan and what's happened. There is a very clear link. Essentially, since probably 20, I'd say 14, there has been a very strong sense of the Old West in retreat. And it's remarkable to remember that really it's only since 2014 that we've seen phenomena like Bolsonaro, Modi, the Russian invasion of Crimea, ISIS taking Mosul. These are relatively recent phenomena. And our failure to respond properly to Putin's invasion of Crimea, our failure to deal adequately with Syria, giving Putin the ability to pose as the great savior of Syria through a violent intervention, and most importantly of all, the incredible betrayal of the Afghan people, which showed an extraordinary lack of care, lack of responsibility, lack of patience on the part of the United States and its allies, certainly contributed to Putin's sense that he could get away with this.
There is, there is a sense, you see some in the media saying, well, this is happening in Europe. There was one commentator who said this is happening to civilized people. Do you think that there's an element, and I want to be very clear to listeners that I'm not at all saying that the world should not respond with solidarity and support to Ukraine, but do you think that there is a sense in which the strength of the response is because this is happening to Ukrainians and not Afghanistans, right? Is there an element of whatever you want to call it, racism or colonialism or sort of outdated thinking about parts of the world that contributes to why the response has been so strong on Ukraine in a way that it just wasn't on Afghanistan?
Possibly, and we often worry about this. Often worried, for example, whether our reaction to what was happening in Bosnia and Kosovo was stronger than our reaction to what happened in Rwanda, for example, going back to the mid-90s. But it is important to remember that the reaction to the horror in Afghanistan in August was very intense. The risk in all of these situations is that in our democratic states, it's very easy to provoke an outburst of empathy. The problem is sustaining it. I remember putting out brief videos that I was filming on the street side on Afghanistan in August, and I would get 2 million views asking for people to show sympathy and solidarity for Afghans, within about 3 weeks, you'd get about 40,000 people watching an almost identical
Right.
message. And the risk with Ukraine is exactly the same.
Well, particularly that there's attention paid on the war itself, but there's also this broader humanitarian um, there's a broader humanitarian issue and a broader humanitarian response that will be needed. I think so far you've seen. Well, actually, let me ask you: what have you made of the response toward Ukrainian refugees so far?
Well, at the moment, we're still lacking real leadership and a real
Mhm.
international refugee coalition. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about Afghanistan or Ukraine. Fundamentally, what we need to do is to take this opportunity, and it's a good opportunity. It's an opportunity for democracies to demonstrate their values. And actually, a great opportunity. I mean, Putin has given an extraordinary opportunity to democracies to show why democracy matters, why our value matters. This invasion of Ukraine could be an opportunity, really, after nearly 20 years of decline in the confidence and legitimacy of democratic states, to rebuild it. But one way to rebuild it is to be generous towards refugees. And by that, I mean building a proper coalition led by the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, European Union, which will really commit to take a predictable, sustainable number of refugees every year. And I would suggest that number should be 0.05% of our populations. That's slightly above what President Biden has committed to take. It's below what the Canadians are already taking, but significantly above what the British, for example, are taking. Nearly double the kind of numbers they're offering to take. Now, if we could put this in place, this could be a real example of the sort of idealism that's really been lacking in international refugee policy since the late 1970s, early 1980s.
You mentioned that this has been basically our global system of refugee resettlement is it's outdated by not years, decades. Why do you think that is? Why is it? Is it is it bureaucracy? Is it xenophobia? Is it why the world has changed so much in the past
It's,
several
it's,
decades? Why
it's,
not this?
it's isolationism. It's extraordinary isolationism. It took enormous courage, really, in the 1970s for people to make the gestures. So, in the case of the United Kingdom, it was Asian communities from Uganda who were threatened by Idi Amin. And Ted Heath, who was then the Prime Minister, Conservative Prime Minister, very boldly announced that he would be prepared to take very large numbers of Asian families from Uganda back to the United Kingdom because they were persecuted. Again, partly under the leadership of Richard Holbrooke, the United States in the late 1970s made a big offer for Vietnamese boat people and ultimately resettled nearly 1.5 million people, an extraordinary number of people, over the 1980s. But since then, the only countries that have really kept up and have really demonstrated these values have been Canada and Sweden. Under President Obama, the numbers dropped very steeply, and of course, under President Trump, dropped more steeply still. And it's still very difficult to engage any senior member of the US administration on this. So, launching the report, easy to get leading Canadian politicians, leading British politicians, but even the most progressive Democrat congressmen and senators are not prepared to sign up to a target on accepting refugees. And that tells you a great deal about what's happened to American domestic political culture.
In a depressing, grim sort of way. Yes, yes, it does. What you know, you talked about if we could get this put in place. What are sort of the steps that you think would need to be um, that we would need to go through to get a refugee resettlement plan like the
Well,
one that you're proposing
so
established?
essentially, I'm envisaging a global refugee coalition, and the core of it will be those countries that have a historic relationship to taking refugees. Unfortunately, many countries don't. China is a very, very large economy, obviously, second largest economy in the world, but it does not take refugees. Japan, which is an enormous economy and a highly developed state, takes only a few hundred a year. In fact, small places like Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, these small European states, take more than the whole of Latin America combined in terms of formal refugee resettlement. So it is a opportunity for, I suppose, what was called the Old West, for
Right.
North America, for Europe, Australia to come together and demonstrate that they can still provide global leadership and do it in a way that I think is eminently manageable. So the idea would be that somebody volunteers to lead it. Could be Germany, which is currently chairing G7, has a new chancellor. Could be an opportunity for President Biden, and a good opportunity for President Biden because it would be an opportunity to say, yes, America's stepping up, but what I'm showing is that through American leadership, we're sharing the burden. Right? We're getting other countries to step up too. This isn't all coming to the United States. These other countries are also committing to take 0.05% of their population. And I think connecting it to issues like Afghanistan and Ukraine will be the right way to do it politically. I'm speaking now as a politician because if you think about Afghanistan, it's not just people from the progressive left who care about Afghans. There are 2 million American servicemen who pass through Afghanistan who care deeply about Afghans and feel deep connections. So it's right across the political spectrum because there has been a very unusual, intimate 20-year relationship between Afghanistan and NATO, the United States and its allies. And you can feel the same with Ukraine. Again, you feel a real outpouring of sentiment. So this is the moment to strike. This is the moment for somebody like President Biden, or it could be Prime Minister Johnson, to step up and say, okay, I'm going to form a global refugee coalition and we'll set it up with a target, let's say 0.05% of your population, which, as I say, would equate to about taking an Afghan family of 5 into a town of 10,000 people. And we will do that year in, year out. And we will work out how to take people from conflict zones, not require them to go into a neighboring country in a refugee camp.
There is, has, since, I mean, for many, many years, but especially since 2015, there have been so many conspiracy theories here in the United States, in the UK, certainly throughout Europe, about, the so-called globalists and, trying to, the supposed or the alleged erosion of borders and this idea that, that cosmopolitans are flooding countries with immigrants, refugees, leaving aside the anti-Semitic and xenophobic undertones of that. How do you, again, speaking as a politician, how do you sort of come up with a narrative that overrides that? Because we've seen that they're
Well,
quite it's quite
so,
powerful messaging.
so I think the answer is that you have to explain that you are going for a sensible, pragmatic middle ground solution. You're absolutely not endorsing open borders. Right? Those sorts of demands which come from a lot of refugee campaigners who basically don't believe in borders at all and believe that everybody should be allowed to cross borders whenever they feel like it, is simply impractical, inconceivable, and I think politically totally untenable. What we're talking about, but equally, the idea that you take nobody, that you accept that people are at risk of extreme persecution, that female judges in Afghanistan could be killed, and you're not prepared to take them out, is also unacceptable. So what you're saying to the population is, no, we're coming up with a number here, 0.05% of our population annually,
Sorry.
which represents a very, very manageable number of people. It represents the number of people that we can absorb, and it's something that we can plan around. And we're going to do it by targeting the people who are most vulnerable. So, in a European context, that's about saying we're moving from a world in which we're saying that, and this is a lot of the politics around this, is people saying these are just young Afghan men who paid traffickers to take them to Greece. Right? Instead, this resettlement plan would work with human rights NGOs on the ground to identify people who were at extreme risk: female judges, human rights defenders, LGBTQ campaigners, journalists, and select those people and move them directly from Afghanistan to refuge in Western countries.
I have just two more questions for you, which is that it often seems to me. I mean, you're seeing it now with the Russian war in Ukraine. So many have come out and said, yes, we'll take refugees. Like here in the United States, yes, they can come here, but the logistics are not in place, right? So there's no, how do you actually get people? It's fine for the governor of New York to say we'll take Ukrainian refugees, but how are you actually getting them to New York State. Do you, I mean, in your experience, how does one match the rhetoric with the practical plan in an unfolding crisis?
So the answer is that people know how to do this. We did it with Vietnamese boat people in the late 1970s. Actually, it's been done in Central America by the United States. It's been done historically with Cuba. Essentially, what you need to do is process on the borders or in country using third parties such as NGOs. You need to have a clear sense of how many people you're prepared to take and a clear sense of criteria which need to be applied. And then you get on with it. I mean, it's remarkable how much you can do. Germany absorbed nearly 1 million people in a year. The United States moved well over 100,000 Afghans, improvising as they went on parole visas into the United States in the matter of a few weeks. So these governments can absolutely do it if the political will is there. Generally, when you hear that there are logistical challenges or bureaucratic challenges, it's because the political will's not there.
Right.
It's not very difficult to design a system because ultimately all you need to do, particularly with Ukraine at the moment, people can get on trains to Berlin, get off the train in Berlin, they can be processed in Germany and they can move to the United States. If New York is serious about taking people, that could be done tomorrow.
What will you be watching as the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine unfolds? What specifically will you be looking at to see how the world adapts? And secondly, you said that Afghanistan, Ukraine, that perhaps this presented an opportunity. Do you think the world will take the opportunity?
So, looking very carefully at Ukraine to work out whether the world is prepared to be serious. I mean, this is, in the most optimistic scenario, what has happened is that the democratic West has been revealed as the sleeping giant, not Russia. That we can potentially now see what it means to have economies which are cumulatively 25 times the size of the Russian economy and what we can do with that in terms of exercising influence in favor of values. But I am still very, very anxious. There is a generation of politicians that have emerged, and I'm afraid in the United States, I feel this sadly, even with some of the most talented people in the National Security Council and the State Department and USAID, who continue to pursue a very isolationist policy. And they claim that they're doing it because they no longer want to be a global policeman, but really they're doing it because they're worried they're being outflanked by Donald Trump and they don't want to seem to be paying too much attention to people outside the United States, to be blunt. So I think that this could be the most extraordinary opportunity. And I think it is an opportunity for the United States in particular to show moral leadership, to take this moment when everybody is focused on Ukraine and say, okay, we're going to do this properly. And we're going to make President Biden's legacy the creation of a global refugee coalition.
Rory Stewart, thank you so much for taking the time.